All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is doing well. For those who do not know me or I haven't met, my name is Harry Kazianis, and I am Senior Director of Korean Studies here at the Center for the National Interest, well, at least virtually. Um, Great to have you here. I know there are many Korea panels happening at the moment. It seems like every day there's two or three that are announced, which I think is great. There's a lot of great focus happening on the Korean Peninsula, on North Korea, on South Korea. So all good things, definitely. So I want to welcome you to a session today that's going to look at how Kim Jong-un sort of sees the Biden administration. And I hope this provides a much needed diversion from all the chaos of US politics and the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, and talk a little bit Korea. So if you can, just allow me a few minutes to maybe take a moment to try and set the scene a little bit, if you will, and sort of offer a little bit of my take of what's happening and maybe the path forward, and then we'll get to business with our great panel. For North Korea, 2020, I think, is going to be looked upon as a year of constant crisis. COVID-19, I think, has aggravated a lot of already existing problems with things like food insecurity, a contracting economy due to international sanctions, and not one, not two, but three typhoon landings, which I think a lot of us, even the best of us of Korea experts, sometimes forget about the impact on. I know it's argued on how much impact, but I mean, typhoon's a typhoon, so clearly there is an impact. I think it's very obvious that COVID-19 has derailed all of Kim's goals for 2020, probably all of our goals for 2020. So I think we can empathize a little bit there. Pyongyang has been very aggressive in locking down internally, but also locking down its borders. So much so that I think it's pretty clear the North Korean economy is essentially ground to a halt. And when you think to maybe how much it's ground to a halt, I mean, the United States did very aggressive lockdowns in late winter and early spring, and 1/3 of our economy essentially disappeared off the GDP rolls. Now, a lot of it's come back, but you have to wonder on how much impact that has on a country like North Korea, who does not have the resources and ability to stimulate its economy and do a lot of sort of those first world things to bring itself back. So something to think about. The good news, if there's any, is that actually on Saturday, I spoke to Trump National Security Advisor Robert C. O'Brien for an on-the-record interview, and he said something actually very interesting, that actually North Korea, and I'm quoting now from O'Brien, so far, they appear to have avoided any sort of mass outbreak of COVID. O'Brien also said that the administration would consider any North Korean request for aid if asked. Now, that's something Pyongyang hasn't been, very happy to accept or, sort of offer anything that it really does need aid, but maybe a small opening. I don't know. I mean, obviously the Trump administration is coming down to its, its end of days, so to speak. So not sure that, Kim would take that up, but, it is something out there. Now, as we look to the future and as Joe Biden takes power, North Korea has quite a few decisions to make. I think that's pretty obvious. My guess is that they look to see what signals come out of Team Biden, maybe in the next few weeks, up until inauguration, a little bit after inauguration. And then I think depending on what Biden does or doesn't do, or where North Korea sits on Biden's list of priorities, I think that's going to dictate what North Korea's actions look like towards Seoul and Washington. I think we'll see a little bit of a preview of what Kim's thinking when we get those readouts from the Eighth Party Congress, end of December, early January, and who's maybe Kim this year will do one of his big end of year, New Year's Day speeches, although there isn't any indications of that. Didn't really do one last year. So as you can see, this is a panel where we have a lot of questions and a lot of ground to go over. But luckily, we have three really amazing analysts who I think are going to take this on and do a great job. So with that, let me just go over very quickly the setup of our webinars here at the center. Very simple and very, very straightforward. So each panelist is going to speak for, let's say, 10 to 12 minutes, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Then we have three panelists. After that, we will take your questions and answers. I know a lot of them have already been sent in to me through DM, email, text. So I'll try to get to as many of those as I can. And we'll see if we can break some ground here. So with that, let me bring in our first panelist, and we are going to go by alphabetical order of last name. So that means Ken Gause. Ken, you're first up here. I think many of you know Ken's excellent work at CNA. He's the director of the Adversary Analytics program there. does a lot of great work on North Korean leadership dynamics, the Kim family. I've been following his work for a long time. He wrote a great book a few years ago, North Korean House of Cards, something I actually look at quite a bit, and I think has stood the test of time. So with that, Ken, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to kick this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry, and thank you for the national interest. I think this is a very timely and important topic to be talking about right now. Of course, all three of us are just going to be, speculating about what North Korea might do, but I think it's worth talking about, at least kind of putting people in the right frame of mind as we go into a transition of power in Washington and what that might mean for North Korea and its calculus and things like that. So as the Biden administration takes the reins in Washington, we are once again faced with the question of whether progress can be made on the persistent challenge of North Korea. Administration after administration has come into office with aspirations of making significant progress on denuclearization, only to leave office looking at 4 to 8 years of minimum progress at most, and outright or even outright failure. Are we facing more of the same under President Biden, or can he possibly implement a strategy that will work? In order to do this, I think you have to look at it from 3 angles. I'm only going to be focusing on one angle here, but I think the 3 angles that you have to look at are: one is, what is North Korea's calculus, especially with regard to its nuclear program? That's the one that I'm going to be talking about briefly. The other is what is likely to be the Biden administration's strategy toward North Korea. We don't know yet, but it's something maybe in the Q&A we can talk about. And then what would be the contours of an effective North Korea strategy? The United States likes to talk a lot about what we have done in the past and why, it just won't work because North Korea doesn't want to engage. Well, I think it's much more complicated than that. And if we want to talk about that in the Q&A, of course we can. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the North Korean calculus. The reason why US policy toward North Korea has failed in the past is that it is understandably starts from the point of view of what is in the best interest of the United States, what's in terms of our equities. North Korea's national security and equities are of secondary or even tertiary importance. And for that reason, we struggle to come up with incentives that tend to focus on pressure. Why? Primarily because it's politically palatable to the people in the United States to think about it in those terms. When we come up with incentives, we're not very well defined, and they are always pitched as something to be given once North Korea gives tangible steps on its toward denuclearization. But if we look at the situation from North Korea's point of view, and taking North Korea's and Kim Jong-un's perspectives into account, some things become quickly very apparent. One is the nuclear program is intimately tied to the legitimacy of the supreme leader. 2, the supreme leader does not have solid successes in other areas, such as the economy, which he can use to offset the legitimacy or the conferred by the successes in the national security realm. 3rd, as the United States and the international community ratchet up the pressure through sanctions to get North Korea to denuclearize, all it does is forces Kim Jong-un to hold more tightly to the nuclear program and reduce the aperture for engagement and diplomacy. And 4th, at the moment, it does not appear that North Korea is willing to part with its nuclear program, and that will continue to be true unless the US can figure out a way to get into a diplomatic process with North Korea. So that being said, what do we know about where we stand right now with regard to North Korea and its calculus toward the new administration? North Korea has been rather quiet since the election, and I think there are some reasons for this. I think that right now they are struggling, obviously, with the COVID situation, which I think dominates a lot of the decision-making space within North Korea right now, thinking about what to do with COVID, how to engage with the outside world, how much to engage, internal security issues. as well as just the health and food issues that they're having to deal with right now with COVID, with the recent typhoons. So in other words, they're busy doing other things right now. I think another important thing that is factoring into Kim's calculus is that they're still waiting to see how this transition of power plays out. With President Trump pushing back against the election, I think Kim wants to be fairly, calm and quiet until that plays out and he actually knows who he's dealing with, President Trump or President Biden. And then third, I think he is waiting for President-elect Biden, to say something that will give an indication of where the United States is going to go. Are they going to return to a policy and strategy of strategic patience as played out under President Obama? Or are they going to actually offer something up? The early indications are, that the Biden administration is taking the politically correct line of saying, that North Korea has to make the first moves or steps toward denuclearization. That's something North Korea obviously does not want to hear. But until they know really who is sitting in the White House and what they're going to have to deal with, probably best to kind of stay quiet for now. And so when we go forward into the new year, and if there is a peaceful transfer of power and Biden takes up the mantle, the new president, then we have to ask ourselves, will North Korea return to its traditional strategy of testing and provocation in order to set the table for diplomacy? That's possible, but it's also possible that if he does tests, that it might have a different calculus behind it. It may be for technological reasons and scientific reasons. Also, the fact that you have China now, who is probably not going to play ball on the sanctions regime as they did back in 2017 or so, it does give them a little bit of space to really kind of strategic message and take a much more aggressive line moving up the escalatory ladder than they might otherwise do, because they know that the blowback probably won't be as severe as it was in the past. So, I can envision two ways going forward here. One, that North Korea continues to focus on its internal dynamics and continues to lean toward China and pretty much puts the US diplomacy with the United States on a back burner. Or two, they can return to their same old tricks of brinksmanship and try to raise the tension, hoping that now with the new administration in Tokyo, with a Moon administration that wants to engage in the inter-Korean dialogue, that both of them will put increasing pressure on the United States to engage and take the steps it needs to engage, which means putting sanctions relief on the table. And so you can envision either one of those ways kind of going forward. But we're just going to have to see. And I agree with you that I think that, the Eighth Party Congress, as well as the New Year's speech, if there is one, should give us some indication on where we may be going in the future. But that's kind of what I've got for right now. Happy to talk about where I think the Biden administration may go, as well as what might be the contours and effective strategy in the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, Ken, thanks so much for that. That was great. So next, we're going to bring in my friend and colleague, John Dale Grover. John, I think many of you know, he's very active on the Korean scene, very active in television, op-eds, doing reports with me at the Center for the National Interest, and I think has a really good, fresh perspective on these events. So John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, for having me. And thank you for all the other panelists for being a part of this as well. So there's several different things to think about in terms of how Kim Jong-un sees the incoming Biden administration. And one of those is Biden is definitely a source of stability and predictability. And there are pluses and minuses when you consider that from Kim Jong-un's perspective. So he's predictable and stable in that Biden has been involved in public service for a long time. A lot of the people that he's nominating to his cabinet are known entities and known quantities. They have a lot of experience. They are part of the establishment. And Biden really wants to kind of do a reset, go back to normal. And this includes reaching out to allies such as South Korea. Biden actually published an op-ed in South Korea saying about how he does value the alliance. He does intend to stop asking for such dramatic increases in the defense sharing that South Korea is doing for the alliance. That's one of the points of contention under the outgoing Trump administration. And so from this perspective, it's going to be a lot more stable. But there's a cost to that. So what this means is with Biden coming in, the real window for opportunity for actual radical change is likely now gone. So when I say radical change, I'm saying the spectrum, right? We had fire and fury with Trump. You could have had a war. You could have had a nuclear war with North Korea. On the other hand, that kind of instability, that kind of uncertainty under Trump also meant you could have had a dramatic opening, again, with all of the summits that we had. So under Biden, more stability. That means Kim is going to be less worried about the kind of negative escalation cycles that could lead to an armed conflict. But he also knows that that means it's going to be a lot harder to get concessions and dramatically open things the way he tried to do with Trump. That window is closed. And that also includes some of the other dynamics that he is looking at. So if you think about South Korea is going to have presidential elections in 2022. They've had dominance by the conservatives, who are very hawkish on North Korea, since 2008. So having Moon in office was a rare opportunity to have Moon and have Trump and have Kim all at the same time. Now that that's gone, there's going to be a lot less opportunity for anything to change. The other thing to mention is that Kim wants to keep his deterrence. He wants to keep himself in power and he wants to keep himself secure. If you look back after Kim Jong-Un took over control of North Korea, he had a lot of work to do. Consolidation of power, elimination of rivals, for instance, his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, and also just ensuring this minimal nuclear deterrent, right? That's why he did such a spurt of nuclear tests and missile tests in order to make sure he could hold Honolulu or Seattle or San Francisco or Los Angeles at risk. The idea that no longer can the United States assume the war will be over there. So Kim's looking at the Biden administration saying, okay, there's a lot less opportunities here, but on the other hand, he's decently secure militarily. The catch, again, of course, is all of the economic stuff, all of his domestic issues in trying to maintain his control. If you remember, if we go all the way back to the 1990s, North Korea was in a very dire straits. They had a combination of all kinds of terrible things. They had famine, they had drought, there was a lot of sanctions that were placed on them, a ton of economic mismanagement. In the 1990s, North Korea's GDP crashed by a third. It was just wiped out, didn't even recover until 2016. 2 to 3 million North Koreans died. Depending on what sources you look at, allegedly there may have been an attempted coup in 1995. It was a very unstable time. And so Kim Jong-un is aware of this, and he's looking at all the different crises that are hitting him now, all of those typhoons, closing the border because of the coronavirus, all of the maximum pressure and sanctions that are on him now. And so he's thinking stability going forward, less opportunity, but nonetheless, he still is driven by those imperatives, maintaining power and also trying to get enough economic prosperity so that it helps him maintain that power. And so he's looking at all of this and he's thinking, how can I go about ensuring that, right? How can I get some sanctions relief? How can I get some trade back? How can I break out of this situation that's very destabilizing, arguably maybe more destabilizing, well, not more, but the most destabilizing scenario we have certainly seen in North Korea, I think, since the 1990s. And there's a few options for him going forward here. So one of those would traditionally be trying to break up the alliance with South Korea, right? So you have a progressive, President Moon Jae-in. Kim is looking at this and thinking, well, the South Koreans really want to make a deal. They really want to open up things. They want to open up some trade. Maybe I can try to do that. Arguably, that's going to be a little bit harder now that the relationship between America and South Korea is more stable because you have agreement on the cost sharing for U.S. troops over there, and Biden really doubling down on making sure the alliance is secure. So with more stability in that, it's going to be a bit harder, I think, for Biden to try to take advantage of the progressive government in Seoul and get some kind of sanctions relief. The other thing is trying to lean on China, and that's a wild card. It really depends on how relationships between the U.S. and China shape up between now and then. Does the rivalry intensify? Will Biden and Xi pursue a detente? We don't know, and that's going to impact how much China is going to be willing to help out Kim Jong-un. So where does this leave Kim? Again, going back, the two things: wants to stay in power, wants some sanctions relief. He could do what Ken said. He could engage in that escalation cycle. This is something we've seen time and time again. North Korea acts up, everyone gets very scared, nuclear test, missile test, finally get back to the bargaining table, get some sanctions relief, cycle repeats. That is probably what's going to happen here. The question is how far he will go. Personally, I don't think he's going to do a nuclear test. He could, but I think that he's going to be cautious enough in trying to figure out Biden, trying to get the measure on him, that he'll probably do something less provocative, such as a series of short-range missile tests. Maybe he'll do an ICBM test. He hasn't tested those enough to be sure they work 100%, right? There's only so much you can do without the sophisticated technology such as that America has to ensure your missiles work without actually so many weapons work without testing them as much. But I think he's going to be a bit more cautious. And so the last thing to mention here is that from the United States perspective is we need to think about arms control. We need to think about small wins. I know that the orthodox kind of way of looking about North Korea is they need to denuclearize, they need to denuclearize. And yes, that would be a wonderful, excellent goal at the end of this. However, Kim wants to keep his power. He knows nuclear weapons are the way to ensure he stays in power. He saw what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And he's also seen what's happened to India and Pakistan. They got nuclear weapons, according to international law, they weren't supposed to, and yet they're, in a part of the community of nations. So he's thinking as long as he can hold out, he will be secure. The catch is, can he get some of that sanctions relief? And so from the U.S. perspective, if we pursue arms control, making sure North Korea does not get more than the roughly 35 bombs, maybe 40 they have now, that would be a good thing for us, and would also mean that maybe there could be some movement on the kind of sanctions relief that he wants. Because as we mentioned before, he's under a lot of pressure with shutting down the border from the coronavirus, issuing public bonds. There was a family that froze to death recently, starved to death, both actually. And so you hear all of these difficult reports, and it's not that Kim cares about his people per se. It's more that he is a rational actor who wants to stay in power. So you have to think about what is in his self-interest and what is in the interest of the ruling elites in Pyongyang. And their interest is keep the bombs, kind of get the measure on Biden, see what he's like, hope you can get some sanctions relief, and know that, again, that window for opportunity for radical change is now over, which again is a good thing in the sense of we're probably not going to be going back to the days of fire and fury, but we're also probably not going to see the days of massive symmetry and, excited love letters and those sort of things, which sounded nice, but in the end did not really bring much to fruition.
All right, well, thanks, John, for that. That was great. Let me bring in Soo Kim now. I think many of you know Soo's excellent work at the RAND Corporation. She's an adjunct at American University, had a distinguished career at the CIA, DHS, and I think brings a wealth of experience onto these issues. So with that, Soo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. As Harry said, it's really been just the season to talk about North Korea, where all of us are sort of weighing in on what's going to happen and what Kim Jong-Un is going to respond, or in what way he's going to respond. I think my colleagues have done an excellent job in covering basically all the bases on North Korea. So I want to focus actually on the Biden administration's perspectives. And I think by illustrating that, we could probably get at what North Korea is thinking. Over the past 4 years, we've seen progress here and there, as well as some symmetry. But really, when we think about it, we've kind of moved the needle of the equilibrium on North Korea to a state where I think we're sort of in this uncomfortable equilibrium. That is to say that perhaps we're not engaging with North Korea enough, perhaps there's not enough incentives, perhaps we're not being forceful enough on the regime. And I think in order for the Biden administration to get any kind of progress on North Korea, it needs to really think about how to reset this pendulum back to a more comfortable state of equilibrium. And the four factors I think that we should be looking at, of course, include how to approach North Korea or the way to engage. Number two, how to deal with our alliances in Tokyo and also in Seoul. Three, the China factor, and also four, which is I think the X factor and probably something more tangential, but probably more pressing for the United States, are the domestic constraints that the administration is going to face. Number one, how to approach North Korea. I think when a new administration comes in, there's this expectation that we're going to be dramatically changing our approach with country X. Given, I think, all of the policies and the approaches and maybe even the precedent that we set with North Korea, it's going to be difficult for the Biden administration to really dramatically alter the course. So at best, what we're probably going to see is perhaps a trying to reset or to at least sort of reshape the dynamics so that we have space to either engage or to enforce and to reimpose some of the more punitive measures that we were trying to impose on North Korea to begin with. The sticking point there, I think, is that with the symmetry with dealing with a very unique administration for the past 4 years, Kim has pretty much tested our limits. So he knows the bounds of US tolerance. He also knows that given that we've kind of moved so far from the equilibrium, that it's also going to take us time to go back to point zero. So that means that he's probably going to have much more wiggle room than say 2016 or even earlier. I think the issue there, of course, is that, again, going back to the expectations that we have for the administration, to sort of press or to pressure the administration to make historic change or to seize an opportunity to realize again another summit or another deal with North Korea, I think is pretty dangerous, of course, given just the how far the negotiations have actually taken us, and also looking at whether or not North Korea broke the self-imposed moratorium on testing on nuclear weapons and ICBMs. The fact of the matter is they were testing, they were developing, and I think development should be considered testing because they were trying to see, one, not just their capabilities, but also testing, of course, the limits and the tolerance of the international community. And Kim has been quite successful on that front. On the question of alliances, again, very unique 4 years where we saw engagement on a different level, where we saw the ethos and the principles of common bonds between the United States and South Korea, US and Japan, and the Trilateral Alliance really been shaken up. The question, of course, is how are the allies going to respond to a Biden administration on alliance issues and also on North Korea? From Seoul's optics, it looks like it's been pretty, I would say, favorable in that, of course, they want to align themselves closely with the new administration ASAP. So we saw that even in the immediate days, I would say, following the declaration of Biden as president, we saw a lot of movement and pronunciations by South Korean officials about where the alliance should go, how they should be dealing with North Korea. And it's encouraging to see that the South Koreans are placing so much emphasis on the US alliance. At the same time, I think we're dealing with two somewhat different visions, I think, about the end state of North Korea. So we have a very good understanding about where the Korean administration sits when it comes to dealing with North Korea. So engagement first, and hopefully with the incentives and the appeasement, we'll see North Korea sort of try to turn around, maybe not 180 degrees, but maybe as close as like 45 degrees, I think would be sufficient for South Korea. That, of course, is not aligned with the ultimate goal of CVID for the United States, and also just reducing the North Korean threat writ large from the region. That plus, of course, the timing of the leadership. So the Moon administration is basically on a tail end of the administration. The end of the term is going to be somewhere in 2022. So about, a little over a year to go, I think. Compare that to the Biden administration, where we're just starting out with not just a clean slate on North Korea policy, but like a clean slate of like every single policy you can imagine. So question about that is where in the priority ranking is South Korea, is Japan, is the Indo-Pacific construct going to be for Biden? And then with that, I think relatedly, where is North Korea going to fit in that picture? And I think that the alliances or the allies, first of all, need to sort of figure out where the direction is for the bilateral and for the trilateral. And then from that point on, I think it's going to be much more, I think, easier to see with a clear eye where they should be taking the North Korea policy. 3, the China factor. That I think, as my colleagues have alluded to, is going to be the most trickiest. One, because the dynamics of North Korea and China, I think, have been somewhat misunderstood. Previously, we thought that, of course, the two are sort of symbiotic in their interactions. At the same time, there's not enough trust between North Korea and China to really sustain the relationship. And I think from the US optic, we could sort of maximize the utility of that to sort of, to put it in this way, to sort of wear at the seams of North Korea-China relations to a point where we can either effect better change on North Korea policy, or to try to weaken the China leverage so that we can actually get rid of, or maybe that's a stronger word, but to at least reduce the impact of China when in dealing with North Korea, because as we all know, the North Korea problem, it's not just a US North Korea bilateral issue, but it's a regional issue that involves the stakes of 6 parties. And to that end, China has been at times, especially in recent years, one of the bigger obstacles to making progress on North Korea. So how the United States tries to deal with South Korea, or with China, and then how the US, of course, tries to use allies like Seoul and Tokyo to affect also change on the China policy is also going to affect the dynamics between Pyongyang and Washington. Lastly, domestic constraints. I'm primarily thinking about COVID-19. We have great news that we have potentially a vaccine that might be effective, but economics is still sort of, it's really struggling all around the world. And for a new leader like Biden to grapple with foreign policy challenges, to grapple with Congress, to grapple with other domestic issues, plus this pandemic that doesn't seem to really be under control, is going to mean that certain priorities, AKA North Korea, may have to take a backseat. And the question is Kim Jong-un going to be okay with that? And of course, provocations were never really off the table. It's just a matter of when and how. So I don't think we can rest easy that any kind of incentives at this point, especially with the new administration, as Kim wants to test the patience of the United States and to see how far he can go. I just don't really see that there's going to be any prospects of appeasement, or so Kim Jong-un might want to provoke, of course, but then the question is, when is he going to do it? How is he going to do it? And for Kim, I think the calculus is not just about, I want to do this so I can make a big bang, but it's also about, how do I do it in such a way that one, it sort of jolts the nerves of the United States, and it also sends a message clearly to the region about the pervasiveness and the lethality of the North Korean threat. Finally, as well, how the US decides to respond, because depending on the timing and of course, and the scale of Kim Jong-un's provocations, the United States might respond differently, perhaps not in full lethal measure, of course, but we might come out to be more stern, I guess, in terms of dealing with North Korea than, say, the past 4 years. So I will open up the floor to questions now.
All right, well, Sue, Ken, John, thank you for all of that. That was outstanding. Really great job to everybody. We're going to move into Q&A now, and I want to just remind everybody just very quickly that there is a Q&A button on the bottom of our Zoom window. So please go in there and type your questions, have a ball. There's lots of things that we could obviously talk about. I have already about 30 questions that were sent in to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of package some of those questions and feed them into our panel and sort of see where we go. The one question that I got from a number of different people is this question of bandwidth. And I think, Sue, you were sort of hinting at this a little bit. I think Ken, John, a little bit as well. I mean, look, we all are very fascinated by the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, denuclearization, the moon government. These things are very near and dear to our hearts. But unfortunately for the Biden government, let's just be honest, they're going to have to deal with COVID-19 first and foremost. Then they're going to have to deal with rebuilding the United States economy. Then from there, they're going to have to pick their foreign policy priorities, which, I mean, looking at it just very broadly, that seems like China to me. I mean, we can debate that obviously, but it seems like North Korea won't even be the first and most important thing in Asia, not even in terms of foreign policy or even, overall. So the question I ask for all of you, and I think, Sue, I'm going to leave you out of this because you sort of touched on this a little bit, is Ken and John, how much bandwidth do you think that Biden is going to give to the North Korean issue? Ken, if you could start first for me, that'd be great.
Frankly speaking, I don't think that the Biden administration will be dealing much with North Korea, unless, of course, North Korea does something early in the administration that we have to react to. I think there's so much on the Biden administration's plate, basically domestically, that they will be focusing on that. And remember, we have to get people in place to develop a national security strategy, and under that, a North Korea strategy. So I suspect the first year is probably going to be, not much dealing with North Korea other than reacting to what North Korea focuses. And where we have to focus on the peninsula or in the region will be on our alliances anyway, and repairing those alliances and bolstering them as opposed to dealing with North Korea. And then whatever little is left over will be dealing with China.
John, what do you think?
I would agree with the domestic considerations and what Ken said about getting the nominees in. I've heard some chatter among different conservative outlets and things about allegedly not letting Biden have a cabinet, which I think is absurd. But that's a real consideration: is how much negotiation and politicking is there going to be just getting everyone in place. Our transition is a huge endeavor, and that's one of the big just a practical domestic concern Biden's going to have to deal with. The other thing is that he's surrounded by a good team. I think that if they recognize the cycle of provocations North Korea does, they won't be as alarmed. Sure, maybe they might bump North Korea up the queue, but there's no reason to freak out. And I think that's a good thing because, frankly, there are other very pressing international things, the extension of New START, trying to get back in the Iran deal. Iran has presidential elections in June. These are much more pressing situations that I think will be at the top of Biden's list more than North Korea, and they should be.
That's fair, John. Thank you. It'll be interesting to see. Ken brought up the point of 1 year of no major change to North Korea policy. I wonder if what Kim would think to that, and if that might press him to think about an ICBM test. I want to move to this question about regime stability. Because thinking about 2020 and thinking about the amount of challenges the Kim regime has had to take on, and like I said before, how COVID sort of exasperates all of those different problems, I've been doing a lot of thinking and wondering about, is there any cracks in the regime right now? Is there any instability? So Ken, I have to ask you this question since this is your area of expertise. How do you see North Korea right now in terms of its overall instability? Do you see any cracks? Do you have any worries about any of the leadership dynamics? And where do you see things going forward over the next few months when it comes to the regime?
No, I don't see any real cracks in the regime. I see pressure on the regime internally because of COVID and the economy, real challenges that they will have to deal with. But we're also seeing things within the political dynamic and political space around Kim that suggest that there's a high level of stability inside North Korea. We're seeing the devolution of authority, not power, but authority down the chain of command as he has put people in place really since 2016. We are now seeing him, now that he has all the critical pieces in play, or in place, he is now beginning to devolve authority down the chain of command, which spreads responsibility around, which obviously there's going to be a lot of, explaining to do about, if things don't go right. So it takes some of the responsibility off of his plate, but it also helps get the regime more invested in moving in a particular direction, hopefully from North Korea's point of view. Once they get out from under these sanctions and things, they will have the the strategy and a leadership that's invested in pushing that strategy forward. So I personally do not see a high level of instability inside the regime. Doesn't mean that things can't happen, but as long as he's got a source of legitimacy, which he has with the nuclear program, since we're denying him the economic success, then I think that he's got the leadership in play. I'm not particularly concerned. The military seems to be under control. The internal security apparatus seems to be under control. The OGD has basically been neutered to a certain extent politically. So I don't see a lot of the places where we would look for instability is really not there right now.
Thanks, Ken. That's a little reassuring. I appreciate that. Let me move to a question from our friend and colleague, David Maxwell from FDD. And I think this is a really important question, so I want to sort of bring this to the top of the pecking order. He writes this: what is your assessment about the pursuit of an end of war declaration? This is something we've heard a lot about over the last few years that is being strongly emphasized by the Moon administration. Specifically, do you think Kim will be moved by such a declaration, and will he respond in a positive way? So Sue, let me kick that over to you first, then we'll go to John, then to Ken.
Sure. So I guess this is just my personal take, but signing an end of war declaration so we're sort of imposing our own expectations about how to deal with North Korea, as well as what the North Koreans might actually want. And by North Koreans, I mean the Kim regime and Kim Jong-un. Fact of the matter is we don't know whether or not this is going to be palatable to Kim Jong-un, but we're thinking that an end of war declaration is going to be helpful in terms of reducing tensions, and also trying to sort of bring a pretty hasty end to the Korean War, or the tensions between the two Koreas. This is something that's been going on for almost 7 decades, and the fact that we can, the idea that we can sort of end all of this in just the signing of a declaration and that everything's going to be back to normal, I think is unreasonable. But I also think that, so the end of war declaration or peace treaty is only going to set the US ROK on the path toward, I don't want to say rupturing the alliance, but I think that there's going to be greater prospects and greater probability for the US and South Korea to really go separate ways, because there would not be really much of a justification for the US presence there. And then, radiating that a few steps forward, or a few steps or a little bit outward, also questions about just the US presence in the region total. And that's also going to be upsetting the balance between the United States and China. And that's going to also compound issues between the two countries, competition. Also about how South Korea, maybe not the leadership or the few select people in the South Korean government, but how the South Korean population and how Japan is going to feel when it comes down to really the realities of signing a declaration and going through the follow-up steps to realizing this peace regime on the peninsula. So one, I think it's about projection, and two, I think it's going to set the peninsula and also the broader region on a path toward, ideally, it's going to be a short-term, pretty much a PR opportunity piece. But I think in terms of the actual concrete foundations for an enduring and long-term peace on the peninsula, I think that's questionable.
John, why don't you take a stab at that for me?
Certainly. I think that we have to think about the political effects, just as Sue said. I think in terms of the political effects, what she said about the long-term down the road with the alliance, that is something that needs to be considered. When I was in Seoul last November, I was talking to some of the conservatives over there, and their concern is that the peace treaty would, in fact, if you had one, would say, well, why do we have the US alliance? Why do we have all these troops here? Of course, conversely, you could also say, well, if there's peace now, why does Kim have nuclear weapons? He doesn't need them if we're at peace. So I think that it cuts both ways, and I think it is a good PR boost. I think it could be a good way to de-escalate tensions. But when that's being done, everyone needs to think through what are the long-term effects of this, as Sue said, and all those ones that we want to have happen, are they not? How do you go about that? I don't think it's a domino thing where you put a peace treaty in and then suddenly the alliance is over and everything's kumbaya. But I do think that it's one step in a very long set of steps if you do want to see a more peaceful region. The last thing I'd comment on that regarding the long-term political effects is that if the alliance does end eventually down the road, if South Korea still is concerned about North Korean nuclear weapons, which I think they could and should be, there was increased chatter when I was there about South Korea eventually getting nuclear weapons. And I would say that the odds of that would increase over time, just because if you're not going to have the US security umbrella, you might as well have your own. And there was a surprising amount of chatter about getting those kind of weapons when I was there in Seoul last November. And they even said that it was more than they've had before.
Ken, what do you think?
I think securing a security deal, a peace treaty, that's the end of the process, not the beginning of the process. Because of all the things that Kim, Sue, and John just spoke of, I think it would be inherently destabilizing because I think the North Koreans or the South Koreans and the Japanese, potentially with the removal or potential removal of the strategic umbrella, could go nuclear. The North Koreans could say, okay, we made a peace deal. We're no longer enemies. Why can't we have our own nuclear program as well? You know, there are too many unknowns there that really, and also I don't think the North Koreans really believe we will give them a security deal up front. What they want is sanctions relief. And I think that's where you begin the engagement process and you work your way through, develop the trust over time, and eventually you will get a chance to seriously negotiate security guarantees, and maybe even a peace treaty. But that has to be, I think, toward the back end of a negotiating process, not at the beginning.
All right, thanks, Ken, for that. Thanks, everybody. Let me take a question now from our colleague, Marcus Garlakis. Marcus, I'm going to apologize to you up front. I have a long Greek-American name as well, and I'm used to people butchering it, so I apologize to you profusely. But you have a great question, so let me read this. Do any of the panelists assess that Kim expects there is a real chance of getting agreement for large-scale sanctions relief from the Biden administration at an acceptable cost? By large-scale relief, I mean something similar to what Kim was asking for at the Hanoi summit. John, I'm going to kick that over to you first, and we'll just kind of, we'll go down the line.
I think that would be an ideal outcome for Kim. If he thought it could be possible, he would certainly pursue it. I don't believe Kim believes it's that likely. As I mentioned before, the window for opportunity of very vast radical change, I think, is more or less closed. That's not to say that we can't be surprised, but I think that Biden's going to run a steady as she goes ship, isn't going to take any too adventurous steps. And I think that as long as Kim can get some sanctions relief, maybe not as much at Hanoi, then that'll be enough for him to keep the pressure a bit down at home, and Kim won't feel as desperate or pressured to seek a bigger deal.
Sue, what do you think?
You know, just realistically speaking, we're dealing with one new administration, and I guess it depends on when this deal or this proposal is going to come about. Not that it's in the making, but let's say that it is. I'm really skeptical that one, that he would expect it from this new administration. One, because he doesn't know what to expect, of course, but two, also, it's, even though North Korea has a really good assessment, probably knows the United States much better than we know them, they have to be realistic about what they want, and to really grab at this big prize in leaps and bounds. I think from a strategic perspective, I just don't think it's going to be really wise for Kim Jong-un to say that I want this big sanctions package under this new administration, where of course there are going to be Korea experts. But I mean, we're dealing with North Korea for the first time as an administration. So that seems very bold. It seems ambitious, but at the same time, you know, North Korea is one of those countries where we say never, but then it actually happens. So, but I do think that it's ambitious, but I think reality-wise, it doesn't seem like it's going to be something that Kim could demand right away. Maybe he could sort of work towards it, just kind of putting out feelers and seeing how the United States responds to certain overtures. But you know, to do this in one big gulp, I think is it doesn't seem to be the North Korea that we I don't want to say that we know, but North Korea that we assume that we know it to be.
My view is that how do we get into the process of negotiation? North Korea is going to expect us to make the first concession, major concession. As the asymmetrically weaker power, they are not going to make the first upfront concession. So how do we get in that when we have the Biden administration saying we expect tangible steps toward North Korea? But let's wipe all of that aside and say that we are able to put something on the table. You know, I think North Korea will take what they can get. If we don't put a full 2016, 2017 rollback of sanctions, I think we can't expect to get all of Yongbyon. We might get parts of it. And then the irreversibility bit, you know, the North Koreans are going to be very skeptical about you know, keeping an eye on Yongbyon and what is irreversible and what is not irreversible. So it's kind of hard to see how we actually get to that point. But maybe if we start out small, especially let the inter-Korean dialogue go forward, make some sanctions relief there, then we can get to a point where down the line, once the US gets its administration in place and its strategy in place, that we could actually seriously engage North Korea and build.
Thanks, everyone. Getting a lot of questions about maximum pressure. And I think a lot of the questions swirl around one point. Is this idea of pressuring North Korea still something that can create an achievable outcome? Maybe not denuclearization, although we can debate that, arms control. I'm always struck by the fact by one statistic in that 90% of North Korea's exports go through China. And if China is not willing to enforce maximum pressure, we have a structural problem that we're not really going to be able to solve, considering the fact that the United States and China are in this very, very, looks like could be multi-decade strategic competition where Beijing may want to use North Korea as leverage, so to speak. So I'm just curious on what each panelist thinks about maximum pressure, its future. You know, would the Biden administration consider maybe raising sanctions? You know, just general, what's your take? Sue, I'm going to ask you to comment first, then John, then Ken.
Sure. Well, so I think the question about pressure, we can't really just say that we're going to apply pressure blindly in North Korea, but it has to be, of course, strategic, and also has to come at the right points, not when North Korea is just looking at North Korean behavior. We have to understand at what points can we apply the pressure so that we actually get the right inducements, so that we actually get the right, the expected or the desired outcome from North Korea. Going to, I think, the China factor, that's again, I guess the X factor or the critical link always seems to be China. The question I have for, I guess, for the rest of us or just for anyone who's listening is, to what extent do we think that we've actually applied enough pressure on China to yield the actual effect? It seems like, rightfully so, of course, but against the backdrop of US-China competition, the trade war, again, the Indo-Pacific construct, and ways to deal with China perhaps indirectly, there seems to be this notion that you know, China doesn't want to, or China's not applying pressure on North Korea because it doesn't want to. That might be right, of course, but then we also have to think about, well, then what is the vulnerability that China has that's sort of preventing Beijing from fully enforcing sanctions or from fully complying with the international community? And that, I think, is where we can be a little bit more aggressive and we can be a little bit more intentional about how we deal with China. Not to say that we should disrupt the stability, of course, or the quasi-stability that we have right now in the region, but I think the question about pressure is about the timing and, of course, the application and how we do it, as well as, of course, whether or not we have the right strategy to really support the pressure mechanism. And two, the China factor, how are we using it, and are we really properly assessing the North Korea-China dynamics that's realistic and constructive to making change, not just on North Korea, but also in our dynamics with Beijing.
I'd agree that the China factor is possibly the factor in terms of how effective maximum pressure is. If China is not applying that pressure, then they're going to continue to prop North Korea up, and they have a lot of incentives to do so. If you consider self-interest and imagine for a moment if we were China, or better yet, if Mexico was a nuclear-armed, impoverished dictatorship across our border, you wouldn't want that to implode. You wouldn't want loose nukes. You wouldn't want millions of refugees that are famished and, you know, mistreated streaming across your border. It's the same thing for China. They're looking at North Korea and thinking we can use this as leverage, and also, God forbid, if that thing collapses. So from Beijing's point of view, stability is the key. And I think for that reason alone, maximum pressure just is never going to be as effective as we would like it or want it to be. That being said, just as Soo mentioned, if we did want to apply more pressure to China to get them to apply pressure to North Korea, we could. I'm not necessarily convinced that that is worth it. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I'm imagining the kind of pressure that you could do sanctioning major banks in China. I mean, you know, there's things that you could do that are very high pressure and will get their attention. But as Soo mentioned, in thinking about in terms of the dynamics with China and this emerging quasi-new Cold War, whatever you want to call it, this competition in the trade war, you know, how much do you want to escalate that? I mean, we've escalated things a fair amount, and you could go further. Is that necessarily worth it? I'm not necessarily sure that I'm convinced of that. The last thing I mentioned is, again, going back to what I said earlier about the famines in the 1990s. North Korea's already been for a lot, and they didn't stop pursuing nuclear weapons completely. I'm not convinced that if you put the screws on, they're going to stop now.
My view is the maximum pressure strategy has been failure, because you have to have a calibrated strategy of pressure and incentives. The problem is the politics in Washington will not allow, and especially the Biden administration, which you know, is going to have, I think, a lot on its hands when it comes to Congress, and it's going to be very difficult to get any sort of package through Congress that looks at the incentive part of the equation. And because of that, you know, maximum pressure makes a lot of sense domestically to say that we're pressuring North Korea to do the right thing. But ultimately, for all of the reasons that Soo and John talked about, you know, it won't work. We're looking at 4 to 8 more years of utter failure as North Korea continues to develop a nuclear weapon system, while China looks at North Korea and they prize stability over everything else. And so China's never going to completely play ball on the sanctions regime. And so we're just wasting our time going through a maximum pressure strategy. We need to come up with something that kind of balances the scales between pressure and incentives, leading with the incentives and using the pressure to try to keep them in place.
All right, well, we've got time, I think, for just one more question. I think it's pretty clear that the Biden administration is not going to be a big fan of these huge summits, whether it's Hanoi, Singapore, or 1 hour summit along the DMZ that are hastily arranged. So I think it's clear that working level talks are going to be something that are going to be pretty important. I just like to get everybody just very quickly their take on how North Korea is going to see that. I mean, they've obviously have had a lot of international attention placed on them due to these big high-profile summits. I mean, you can't deny the fact that in some respect, Kim Jong-Un has been legitimized, whether you like that or not. I mean, he is now a player on the international scene. Do you think North Korea would be okay to sort of going back to that bottom-up approach? And I'm just thinking what challenges we could have. I mean, we've tried working level talks in different iterations throughout the decades, and it just seems like the North Koreans, when they bring in negotiators, they have no power to make concessions. I mean, Hanoi is a great example of this. It wasn't widely reported, but the North Korean negotiating team had no power to really make any concessions on denuclearization, and basically told Steve Biegun's team that, well, you're going to have to wait for Kim Jong-Un to get here, and he has a big gift to give Donald Trump. Well, we all know what the big gift is, and Donald Trump walked out. So I just wanted to see what people thought about this concept of working level talks and where it might go. John, why don't you go first, then Ken, then Soo, and we'll wrap up.
Sure. So I'd say, just as you mentioned, Harry, are they empowered? That's a big question. Are those lower level negotiators empowered? Also, I have a leaf blower outside of my window now. Perhaps we should come back to me in a moment.
Oh, thanks, John. These things happen. We've got to deal with them in our Zoom world. Sue, what do you think?
So, I mean, that should be I guess, when we do try to reset or to put the needle back on the equilibrium, that should be ideally where negotiations start, is the working level, so that you can work from the bottom up. And as the question is, of course, is Kim going to be okay with it? Well, I think the question that we should be asking if he's going to be okay with it, but because I think that's the mentality that we've been in, where we've sort of kind of put ourselves in this position where we're always looking to North Korean behavior to sort of dictate our own policies. That's not to say that we should be extremely aggressive and clamping down against the regime, but I think one way to really condition the North Koreans is to say, you know, for once, you know, we don't have to always go by the past precedent, but we could always just say that, you know, of course, the summits didn't work, and we have to come back to the way the United States has been conducting diplomacy, not just with North Korea, but with other countries around the world. And you know, if North Korea doesn't want to do that, then, you know, I just think that the question about, you know, is Kim going to be okay with it, sort of makes this assumption or projects this expectation that we're always going to be the ones responding or reacting to North Korean behavior. And I think that the policy or the strategy that should be effective is not one that sort of does that, but one that sort of expects and sort of anticipates North Korean behavior, so that we could have something in place where we can preempt, we can discourage North Korean or Kim Jong-Un actually from acting out, so that we can make progress either way through diplomacy or through a more, I guess, you know, a pressure campaign, for lack of a better word.
John, you good now?
I may be. How is it, Harry?
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
So
Well,
it's 2020, man. So essentially, going off of what Sue said, she is right about it. You know, we can't just consistently being reacting all of the time. I think that it's a good idea to try to plan ahead to what extent that the Biden administration can do that. Going back to a previous question, perhaps it would be a good idea if Biden delegated to someone to work with South Korea on trying to preempt any kind of provocative behavior that Kim may be mulling over. I think that would be good, not just because the provocation, you know, it isn't so dire that you have to deal with it right away, but also just because, you know, the Biden administration doesn't have a lot of bandwidth and does not need to have that suddenly on their plate in addition to everything else. So I think that Sue is right in that regard, and that's something that should be considered.
Ken, you have the last word, my friend.
Yeah, my view is the bottom-up strategy alone traditionally will not work with North Korea. I think that I was a big fan of the top-down strategy, but I understand that Biden is not going to want to do it the way that Trump did it. He could strategic message, you know, major points that show that the top of the leadership structure in the United States supports a particular initiative. Then you build that up with bottom-up strategy of engagement, and maybe that's the way that the Biden administration would do it, as opposed to the zero. I think ultimately, in order to get some of these big deals done, Biden will probably have to meet with Kim Jong-Un or somebody very, very senior in the administration who has Biden's blessing, and maybe President Moon can be the intermediary there to kind of make that kind of set the framework for such a negotiation.
All right. Well, I want to thank all the panelists, all the guests for joining us today. I think this was a great discussion. Obviously, the next few weeks are going to be key. You never know what's going to happen when it comes to North Korea, so we'll have to stay tuned. Thank you, everybody, and everybody stay safe, and I hope you have a happy holiday. Take care now.